I know how deeply you, the entire nation, and I think I may say the whole world, sympathize with me in the irreparable loss we've all suffered.
The request did not concern an ordinary necklace, a forgotten brooch, or a tiara gathering dust inside a royal vault. Camilla wanted Cullinan II, the immense diamond, fixed into the Imperial State Crown, temporarily removed and remounted for her personal use. The paperwork reached King Charles in a sealed red folder. He read the final page twice, placed his pen beside it, and issued a refusal that stunned the palace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles remained alone at his desk while an aide waited near the door. The Imperial State Crown, the ceremonial crown worn by the sovereign at state occasions, held Cullinan II at its front, where the diamond represented continuity, constitutional authority, and the burden carried from one reign to the next. It was not a jewel that could be borrowed. It was part of the monarchy's identity, guarded as an inheritance rather than owned as a private possession. The king reached the sentence claiming the stone would reflect the queen's individual place in the reign, and his expression hardened. He read it again. The request asked for the second star of Africa to be removed, fitted into a ceremonial brooch, and worn by Camilla for an anniversary portrait. The queen consort expected approval because she believed the gesture would confirm trust, permanence, and recognition after years beside him, under relentless judgment. Camilla waited with unease. She had expected a private conversation, perhaps a discussion about timing and security. Instead, silence stretched across the palace. She asked her secretary whether the folder had reached Charles, then asked again when no reply came. Each unanswered hour felt less like delay and more like warning. The refusal was absolute. According to a documented account later given in a private interview by a senior palace insider, the monarch wrote across the release authorization that the diamond was not to be disturbed, removed, reset, or privately assigned. He left no room for compromise and invited no second request. Charles ordered copies sent to the keeper of the jewel house, the official responsible for safeguarding the crown jewels, and to senior royal advisors. That quiet action changed everything. Camilla could no longer reverse the decision through affection, persuasion, or an informal appeal behind closed doors. The deeper shock was not that she had demanded the stone. It was that she believed the king had once given her reason to think he might agree. To understand why Camilla considered the request possible, the story must move beyond the sealed folder and into the complicated loyalties of the three people who understood exactly what that diamond represented. Behind the jewel dispute stood three people, with three completely different ideas of loyalty. Camilla saw the diamond as recognition after years of judgment. Charles saw it as a boundary he could not cross without weakening the crown. William saw something more dangerous, a test of whether royal treasures would remain symbols of the institution or become rewards distributed through private affection. Camilla had spent years moving from public rejection toward reluctant acceptance, and the proposed anniversary portrait carried deep personal meaning. She did not want to appear simply beside Charles as a supportive wife. She wanted to be recorded as a central figure in his reign, wearing a jewel powerful enough to silence every lingering suggestion that her position remained uncertain. The Imperial State Crown, the ceremonial crown representing the sovereign's authority, could not be altered casually, but she believed the king might make an exception for her. The warning arrived quietly. Camilla's private secretary entered, spoke in a low voice, and explained that the release request had met resistance. The queen consort remained seated. She removed her glasses slowly and asked whether the refusal had come directly from Charles. When the secretary hesitated, she asked again. Her voice stayed controlled, but the hurt beneath it was impossible to miss. Charles felt the same pressure from the opposite side. He understood exactly why the jewel mattered to her, yet he also understood what approval would mean. Removing Cullinan II from the crown would create an institutional precedent, a previous royal decision that future requests could use as justification. Once affection had opened that door, another monarch might struggle to close it. William entered the king's private library after learning that a regalia release request had triggered additional security checks. Regalia meant the crowns, staffs, and ceremonial objects connected to royal authority. The prince had not been told about the request or the refusal. He had discovered both through the protective procedures surrounding the diamond. William chose his words carefully, but anger tightened every sentence. He asked Charles whether the crown was now being treated as a private jewelry collection. The king answered that the request had already been rejected before his son knew it existed. That answer eased nothing. The future monarch feared the danger reached far beyond Camilla. A senior palace insider later explained in a private interview that William's concern was about precedent, not simply personality. If one fixed crown jewel could be removed for a portrait, another could be demanded for an anniversary, a tribute, or a private celebration. The line would weaken each time. Charles's refusal looked sudden, but the desire behind the request had been growing for months. The conflict did not begin when the red folder reached the king. It began weeks earlier, during a closed-door regalia review, when a single remark changed the atmosphere inside the room. The point of no return came during a closed regalia review at St. James's Palace. The gathering was meant to settle minor details for an anniversary portrait, clothing, insignia, and ceremonial pieces. Then the Imperial State Crown was presented for reference. Camilla stepped closer, studied the enormous diamond at its base, and quietly told the keeper, "That is the stone the portrait requires." The room tightened around those words. The regalia review, a private meeting used to examine crowns, jewels, and ceremonial objects before an official event had been arranged so designers could coordinate Charles's appearance with the anniversary portrait. Camilla had already been offered historic brooches and necklaces from the royal collection, but she believed each one placed her safely beside the king rather than firmly within the story of his reign. Camilla wanted more than decoration. She wanted a symbol powerful enough to end the quiet suggestion that she remained secondary, tolerated but never fully embraced. The smaller pieces carried beauty and history, yet none carried the authority of Cullinan II. To her, the diamond did not simply complete the portrait. It declared that she belonged at the center of the monarchy's next chapter. The keeper of the jewel house became visibly uneasy. He closed his presentation notes, glanced toward the queen consort's secretary, and explained that the stone was structurally integrated into the Imperial State Crown. The keeper, the official responsible for protecting and managing the crown jewels, made clear that removing it would require specialist work, security approval, and direct authority from the sovereign. Camilla did not retreat. She asked whether the real obstacle was structural or whether officials simply lacked the courage to imagine her wearing something historically reserved for the monarch. Her question landed harder than anyone expected. The keeper repeated that no decision could be made inside that room, but she pressed him again. One advisor then made the mistake that changed everything. He explained that a specialist jeweler could theoretically remove the diamond without causing permanent damage. The answer was intended as technical clarification, nothing more. Camilla heard something else. She heard confirmation that the barrier was not the crown itself, it was permission. A senior palace insider later disclosed in a documented private interview that the queen consort requested measurements, security requirements, and a preliminary mounting design before Charles had approved anything. She believed she was preparing a serious proposal. The king saw preparations moving around an authorization he had never granted. Charles felt cornered before the conversation even began. When he learned how far the request had advanced, he summoned Camilla privately. What followed was no longer a debate about diamonds or portrait design. It became a painful reckoning between a husband who felt cornered and a wife who believed she was still being denied her rightful place. No aides remained in the room when Charles placed the request between them. Camilla stood near the fireplace, expecting discussion, perhaps negotiation. Instead, the king pushed the unsigned authorization across the table and told her the decision was final. She asked whether he was refusing because of security, tradition, or William. Charles looked directly at her and answered, "It is not mine to give you." Camilla did not move. The private sitting room had been cleared so they could speak without advisors, secretaries, or courtiers shaping every word. Charles wanted the argument handled as both a royal dispute and a marriage in crisis. He explained that Cullinan II belonged to the regalia of the crown, the historic objects attached to the sovereign's office, and could not be removed simply to strengthen one person's image. The queen heard something colder. She accused him of allowing years of public hostility to decide how he treated her behind closed doors. She had carried the duties, absorbed the criticism, and stood beside him when every appearance was judged. Why, she asked, was she expected to accept the burdens of queenship while being denied its most powerful symbols? Charles tried to remain calm. He told her the diamond was not a reward, not a private gift, and not something even he could treat as personal property. The monarch knew that once a fixed crown jewel was released for one portrait, Every future request would point back to that decision. Camilla pressed harder. She asked whether the real fear was William. The suggestion broke his restraint. The king set down his glasses sharply and told her the refusal had been made before the prince knew anything about the request. He would not allow his son to be used as an excuse for a decision that belonged to him alone. The wound beneath the argument finally surfaced. Camilla reminded him that he had once promised she would never again be treated as temporary, secondary, or quietly set aside when royal pressure became uncomfortable. To her, the diamond had become proof that the promise still meant something. Charles answered with painful clarity. Granting her access would not confirm her place. It would expose them both to the charge that love had overridden stewardship, the duty to protect royal property for future generations. He could defend her dignity, but he could not purchase it with the crown. Camilla left without touching the folder. The door closed, and Charles immediately ordered the refusal written into formal regalia protocols. The argument had ended, but the barrier was only beginning. He was turning a private wound into an institutional rule, and that shift revealed where royal power truly rested. By the following morning, the refusal no longer belonged solely to Charles. Security officers, jewel custodians, constitutional advisors, and the keeper of the jewel house had received written instructions. The king had transformed one private no into a chain of safeguards. Yet as William read the memorandum in silence, he realized the document contained a clause that could reshape how every future request for royal regalia would be judged. William read the page twice. The memorandum, a formal written order recording the monarch's decision, made the boundary unmistakable. Charles remained the central authority in approving the use of major regalia, but custody, security, conservation, and precedent surrounded every physical alteration with additional layers of control. The crown jewels could not simply move because one person wanted them to. The prince reached the central clause and paused. No permanently mounted jewel could be removed for personal ornament, private portraiture, family commemoration, or symbolic elevation outside a constitutional ceremony. That term meant an official event connected to the sovereign's public role, not a private celebration shaped by personal feeling. William felt relief first, then sadness followed. The future king understood why the rule mattered, yet he also understood what it revealed. His father had been forced to protect the crown against pressure coming from inside his own marriage. Charles had chosen duty, but the choice had carried a private cost. A senior palace insider later revealed in a documented interview that one courtier proposed a softer compromise. Camilla could wear a replica stone in the portrait, allowing the image to suggest Cullinan II without disturbing the original. The idea seemed clever. It also seemed dangerous. Charles rejected it immediately. A replica would preserve the appearance of a privilege he had already decided should not exist. The king knew symbols could mislead as powerfully as actions. If the portrait suggested that the queen had been granted the diamond, the public distinction between private jewelry and sovereign regalia would disappear. William understood the warning. Future requests would not begin with removal. They would begin with imitation, suggestion, and carefully managed appearances. Once the illusion became accepted, the next monarch would inherit pressure to make it real. Another consequence followed in silence. The preliminary brooch design was sealed, catalogued, and removed from circulation. The design could not be revived under a future sovereign without a completely new authorization. Charles was not merely stopping the present request, he was closing the route by which it might return. Officials believed the matter had been contained. Camilla believed otherwise. When she returned to her rooms, a revised portrait brief was already waiting on her desk. The crown had protected itself through paperwork and protocol, but the first personal consequence had finally arrived. Camilla opened the new portrait file expecting a substitute jewel. Instead, she found a completely different composition. The queen would stand slightly behind Charles, wearing a modest family brooch, while the Imperial State Crown remained beside the king as the dominant symbol of authority. She stared at the page, closed the folder, and asked everyone to leave. Only then did the full meaning of the refusal reach her. Camilla understood the message immediately. The anniversary portrait had been redesigned to remove any suggestion that she would wear, hold, or visually share authority with a fixed part of the crown jewels. Those jewels, the historic crowns and ceremonial objects connected to the sovereign, were being kept firmly on Charles's side of the image. The change mattered, because portraits did more than record appearance. They shaped how future generations understood rank, closeness, and power. The cancellations followed quickly. Palace planners ended the specialist consultation, stopped the proposed security transfer, and removed the private fitting that had been tentatively reserved before Charles reviewed the request. Each decision closed another door. What had once felt like preparation now looked like a process being erased. Camilla dismissed her staff and remained alone. She removed the brooch she was already wearing, placed it beside the revised sketch, and sat without speaking. The queen consort had expected resistance, perhaps even delay, but not a complete redesign that reduced her role before she had been personally told the final decision. The humiliation deepened when she realized several officials had known first. Charles's refusal had moved through security offices, jewel custodians, and portrait planners before it reached her private rooms. She had not merely lost the diamond. She had become the last central figure to understand what the palace had already decided. A senior insider later revealed in a documented private interview that Camilla briefly considered withdrawing from the portrait entirely. Her private secretary warned that absence would expose the dispute more clearly than any jewel ever could. The queen would not appear wounded. She would appear defeated. Charles learned of the possible withdrawal and refused to pressure her. Instead, the king sent a handwritten note. He told her he wanted his wife beside him, but he would not purchase that unity with something belonging to the crown. The words were gentle. The boundary was not. Camilla read the note twice. It prevented an immediate public rupture, but it did not heal the private wound. That could happen only when Charles entered her room without advisors, files, or royal language between them. With the palace machinery finally silent, husband and wife were left to confront the question hidden beneath the diamond: whether love could survive a boundary. Neither of them was willing to pretend did not exist. Charles arrived after dark without an equerry, a secretary, or the red folder. Camilla was seated beside the unopened portrait plans. For once, there was no council language and no ceremonial argument. He told her that refusing the diamond had not been an attempt to diminish her. It had been an admission that some objects must remain beyond even the wishes of a king and beyond the promises of a husband. The silence between them carried more weight than the dispute itself. An equerry, a royal aide who assists the sovereign with official duties, would normally have remained nearby, but Charles had come alone because no institution could resolve what had become personal. He and Camilla had spent hours avoiding one another after the revised portrait decision, each waiting for the other to speak first. Charles finally explained what he had been unable to say inside the earlier confrontation. The Imperial State Crown would pass into another reign. One day, William would inherit not only its authority but every exception created before him. If the king removed Cullinan II out of affection, the future monarch would inherit the pressure, the precedent, and the accusation that personal loyalty had weakened public duty. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then she admitted something harder. She had never truly needed the diamond to complete the portrait. She needed proof that her place could no longer be reduced whenever tradition became uncomfortable. The queen consort had spent years surviving judgment, and the stone had become a shield against the fear that acceptance could still be withdrawn. Charles accepted his own failure. He told her he should have drawn the boundary before the request reached designers, custodians, and security officials. His silence had allowed hope to grow. By the time he refused, the decision felt less like private honesty and more like public correction. The king offered no substitute from the crown jewels. Instead, he placed a small private brooch before her, one that had belonged to his grandmother's personal collection. Unlike sovereign regalia, it carried family memory rather than constitutional authority. It belonged to affection, not office. Camilla understood the distinction. She accepted the brooch, not as compensation for Cullinan II, but as proof that Charles was separating love from ownership, rather than denying love altogether. The wound did not disappear, yet something inside the argument finally softened. Their agreement remained private for only a few days. The official portrait was already moving toward release, and the missing diamond would soon become impossible to ignore. The personal confrontation had reached a fragile peace, but one absent jewel was about to become louder than anything Camilla could have worn. The official portrait appeared at 8 in the morning. By 9, the image was everywhere. Charles stood beside the Imperial State Crown, while Camilla wore the smaller family brooch selected after their private reconciliation. The absence of Cullinan II from her attire became the story. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered beneath the gates, as newspapers declared that the king had drawn a line even his queen could not cross. Palace officials reacted within the hour. They issued a carefully worded statement, explaining that the portrait honored the difference between personal jewelry and constitutional regalia, the crowns and ceremonial objects connected to the sovereign's public authority. The message avoided any mention of the private dispute, yet the silence around the diamond only made the speculation louder. The coverage divided almost immediately. Some commentators described the refusal as a public humiliation for Camilla, proof that her place remained limited despite her title. Others praised Charles for treating the crown jewels as inherited responsibilities rather than family possessions that could be distributed through affection. The same portrait became either an image of rejection or an act of royal discipline. Camilla watched the morning coverage beside her private secretary. She remained outwardly calm as presenters repeated the story, but her hand tightened around the edge of the newspaper when one commentator called the request an attempt at personal elevation. The queen consort had accepted the boundary in private. Hearing strangers turn that painful acceptance into ambition reopened the wound. Charles heard the same words from the next room. The king nearly ordered officials to issue a stronger defense of his wife, one that would explain her motives and challenge the harshest claims. Camilla stopped him. She told him another statement would not protect her. It would only confirm that something serious had happened behind palace doors. The public moment became impossible to contain. Outside Buckingham Palace, a newspaper vendor raised a front page dominated by the official portrait, and the headline, "The Diamond the King Would Not Give." Tourists and royal watchers photographed it beneath the balcony, transforming one absent jewel into the symbol of the entire dispute. Then the tone began to shift. A national broadcaster framed the episode not as a marital defeat, but as the first major test of Charles's willingness to place the institution above personal loyalty. Sympathy moved unexpectedly toward both figures, toward the monarch who had refused, and toward the queen who had remained beside him. As the noise slowly settled, a palace insider disclosed in a recorded private interview that Camilla made one final decision. The world had delivered its judgment through headlines and crowds, but the true verdict would be written when she faced the crown once more. Weeks later, Camilla returned to the secure chamber where the demand had begun. The Imperial State Crown rested behind glass. Cullinan II fixed exactly where it had always been. This time, she did not ask for measurements, designs, or release papers. She stood beside Charles, looked at the diamond, and told the keeper that no future request should ever be made in her name to remove it. Camilla made the withdrawal formal. She ended every remaining part of the request and supported Charles's written rule preventing permanently mounted crown jewels from being released for personal display. The rule mattered because those jewels were not private gifts. They belonged to the continuing office of the sovereign and had to pass untouched from one reign to the next. The anniversary portrait remained unchanged. Cullinan II stayed inside the Imperial State Crown, while the private family brooch became the piece Camilla wore beside the king. It carried no constitutional authority, the official power attached to the monarch's role, but it held something the diamond could not offer, a personal connection freely given, rather than institutional power temporarily borrowed. Camilla finally admitted how deeply the refusal had wounded her. She told Charles that it had touched years of insecurity, judgment, and fear that her place could still be reduced without warning. Yet the Queen also admitted that wearing the stone would never have erased that history. It might have silenced critics for one day, but it could not heal what she had carried for years. Charles answered without triumph. The king told her that the strongest proof of her place was not receiving everything she requested. It was remaining beside him after hearing a refusal delivered in the name of duty. He had protected the crown, but she had protected their marriage by accepting the boundary without turning the wound into revenge. A senior palace insider later revealed in a documented private account that Charles added a handwritten note to the sealed file. The monarch wrote that Camilla's acceptance had protected the monarchy more powerfully than wearing Cullinan II ever could. William later read the final memorandum, a formal record of the decision, and understood what he had inherited. The prince saw that the crown jewels would pass forward intact, protected from private bargaining by a rule born from painful family conflict. No one truly won. Camilla lost the jewel, but gained the dignity of restraint. Charles refused the woman he loved, but preserved a boundary no sovereign could abandon. The diamond remained, the marriage endured, and the monarchy emerged stronger, because neither affection nor insecurity was allowed to own what belonged to generations. There was nothing left to release, reverse, or reconsider. The second star of Africa remained in the crown, and Charles and Camilla finally understood the difference between wearing royal power and protecting it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.